labor that's going to be expanding in Africa over the years ahead. Both the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the African Union's Agenda 2063, both of those documents recognize the absolute essential need of expanding infrastructure. And therefore, the question is how and what are our priorities in this area are very much on the agenda for Africa today. When we look at the question, if you look at the continent as a whole, you can take a picture. I use it in my history classes on African history. You can see from a nighttime sky, there's no lights in Africa relative to the rest of the world. And that itself is a damning reality, the lack of infrastructure. If you look at the continent as a whole, very small pockets around South Africa, North Africa, around the Maghreb, and then around Nigeria, the Bight of Benin. Also, if you look at it from any other standpoint, if you look at the amount of rail that exists in Africa, rail lines, kilometers of rail is minuscule. You measure kilometers of rail by the length of the rail divided by the square area of the country. And it almost doesn't register in most countries, the amount of rail. This is true with roads and other areas. But if we just take those two areas themselves, this is quite a significant challenge. The question, though, of looking at infrastructure, there's two immediate applications for Africa. One is, and this is a historical fact of infrastructure, is it adds economic value to your economy. Infrastructure increases the productive capability of your economy to produce more wealth for more people. It increases the growth rate because it adds, by infrastructure, you're adding a new technology that surrounds your system of production. So every worker, every farmer becomes more productive by the implementation and increasing the density of infrastructure surrounding that economic unit. For example, in Africa, you have upwards of 40%, not in all cases, of food that rots because you don't have refrigerated railroad cars to move it. And as previous speakers mentioned, you can't get from one part of the country, continent to another. As was mentioned by an earlier speaker, this was absolutely intentional by the Berlin Conference. If you look at every country that was colonized by the French or the British primarily, Nigeria I know well. I spent many weeks and months in Nigeria traveling the country. It was very clear, Lord Lugar made it essential that there would not be infrastructure, just the palm oil to the port of Lagos. And that's fairly typical. That was fairly typical in Kenya when the British came in. That was the case all over. So if you look down from the top, there's no east-west railroad in Africa. There's no north-south railroad, although there are some north-south roads being built. There are east-west roads being built. But if you look at the essential qualities, energy, it is not possible to have an industrialized manufacturing society unless you have abundant energy and you have access to energy. And I think we all know that you have approximately over 600 million people living in Africa without access to electricity. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have 100,000 megawatts for 1 billion people. Absurd. And 40,000 comes from South Africa. So you can't run an economy without energy. Rail lines, connecting major cities, capitals, and ports by rail revolutionizes your economy. There have been major studies done in our own country. It was people like Henry Carey, Friedrich List, saw the value of railroads because railroads bring in new science, new technology. If you had a railroad running from Port Sudan or Djibouti all the way across to Dakar, you would revolutionize all those economies. They would be changed. You'd have power structures along each side of the railroad. You'd have new manufacturing centers. All this is possible. All this is necessary because and when you bring in a new technology, it brings in a new science capability, and a new infrastructure brings in a new science capability, which then can transform the economic mode even to a higher level. So you're dealing with integrated infrastructure platforms that continually advance and change. One of the most, I was very happy to read yesterday morning, or this morning, that Paul Kagame and Rwanda have signed a deal with the Russian nuclear energy industry to have nuclear power plants built in and operating in Rwanda, and talking about 2024, so that's only 5 years away. Egypt has already contracted with the Russians for 4 nuclear power plants, producing several thousand megawatts of power. South Africa has been in discussions with both Russia and China on this question. Nuclear power is exactly the new type of infrastructure technology you want for Africa. I mean, not only can one unit supply with 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt, but it gives you a higher form of technology. It gives you more capability. It gives you greater energy flux density. It's ideal for desalination. Right now, I guess most of you are aware, there's a big controversy going on between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The Ethiopians are going to build the dam. They have the sovereign right to do it on the Blue Nile. But the Nile is not big enough for the 500 million people who depend on it, much less the next generation. So you have to create a new Nile. You have to create another 80 billion cubic feet of water. You do it by desalination. The best way to desalinate is nuclear energy. So I go on in this area, but this is the direction of progress. In our country, we built our whole country on this conception, from Alexander Hamilton and George Washington up through Abraham Lincoln, through Franklin Roosevelt, through John Kennedy, always seeing the potential infrastructure to build the United States, from canals to Lincoln's efforts and success in building the railroad even after he was assassinated. The East-West Railroad changed the United States forever, and changed the world forever, because all the other great countries, such as Sergei Witte of Prussia and the Russians and everyone else, began copying the railroad. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was built in following the East-West Railroad of the United States. We need railroads crisscrossing Africa. We need hundreds of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail connecting every part of the country, so you can go Cape to Cairo, not for Cecil Rhodes purposes, but for purposes of development. You can go east-west. You can have a trunk line across the Sahara Desert, connecting up to a line along the Maghreb. I produced graphs and information on this. This is where we have to invest. It's the same thing, as I said, with energy. Without investment in these areas, we will not succeed in meeting the requirements of the continent and actually developing its resources, which have not been ever fully developed. They've just been stolen periodically and looted, but they've never been fully developed. If you look on the question of the effects, as the moderator said, on labor, you want to train your labor to learn the next skill level. If you bring in more advanced technologies, then you bring in the capability of more training centers, more educational centers. And so you constantly have an upgrading of your semi-skilled to skilled, your skilled engineers. You have to have a certain portion of your labor involved in scientific research. So you need engineers and scientists, African engineers and scientists doing this. Because then you actually spread knowledge and you're able, your people, to assimilate new advances and operate them. And this is not new. I don't know if any of you read Chikanta Diop, but he wrote about this in 1960. He wrote a nice little book called The United States of Africa. And he talked about having nuclear energy in Africa then as a training center for youth. Now, the extractive industries, which the West has mainly focused on since independence in the 1960s, do not produce a number of jobs. They are not a job-producing industry. So therefore, we shouldn't focus on them. What we should focus on is building up infrastructure to produce industrialized manufacturing societies. Africa, with 1.2 billion people, has the lowest value added, less than 3% value added in manufacturing goods in world trade. So that's horrible. There are no real strong manufacturing centers in Africa at this moment. So if we want to have jobs for the future, we are losing time by not making these investments now. Val talked about 1.2 billion people and 60% youth. The projections are by 2050, we're going to have 2.5 billion people on the continent, and 1 billion will be youth. So if we don't have jobs, and I'm not talking about makeshift jobs, meaningful, productive jobs, jobs with dignity, jobs where people go out, they earn a living, they get a paycheck, not the informal economy, which is a disaster, but a real job with a real paycheck that you can take home and you can buy a house and you can raise a family, so that the children of today's children grow up and they have expectations and they have hope for the future. The biggest problem we're going to have if we don't start this massive investment program now is what is going to happen over these next 30 years when the population doubles. If we don't do what is necessary now and have a mass economic mobilization for economic development built around infrastructure, driven by science and technology, then we're not going to, the problems we have with Boko Haram and all these other groups which feed off of desperation and poverty are going to expand rapidly. And we're not going to be able to control them if they keep expanding. So the fact of the matter is, these are the types of programs that we have to work on. Now, China has taken up the issue of providing infrastructure for Africa. And a lot of people object to it, but frankly, the arguments are false. China has built infrastructure in countries that has changed those countries. I was there in 2016 at the inauguration of the Addis Ababa-Djibouti train. I was just reading yesterday that the success of this railroad in bringing fertilizer into Ethiopia from the port of Djibouti has expanded agricultural production in Ethiopia. The standard gauge in Kenya is another area we can see massive expansion. New ports are being built. All these endeavors by the Chinese, which are involving themselves in the future of Africa as assistants and allies, is the exact way we should have gone. The West should have done this 50 years ago, but it refused to, and is still refusing to. We have one example in the last 50 years, since independence, 60 years, of involvement by the President of the United States, involvement in infrastructure. And that was John F. Kennedy's collaboration with Kwame Nkrumah in building the Volta Dam project, which would not have happened because the British were against it. And Kennedy stepped in, and we had that project, and that's the last time we've had an executive officer of the United States involved in building infrastructure in Africa. So if we want to meet the challenges of tomorrow, 30 years from now, we want to deal with the massive expansion, which is good. More people is better. Each child has a creative mind, and that creative mind can make a contribution to the universe. But then we have to work now to actually implement those policies, which are on the table in 2063 agenda, which are on the table in the free trade agreement. But if we don't actually take executive action, we will not meet the needs tomorrow. If we do, then we can see a transformation on the continent. I'm very optimistic. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm going on 69, and I'm confident we can do this if we get commitment from the leaders in Africa and we get assistance from Africa's allies around the rest of the world. And then I think Africa's future will be very bright as we look ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. And
but that's not the real world. I mean, you have to take into account 500 years of slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. So why does Africa need help? Well, look at the Naira. The Naira is not traded worldwide. It's not a convertible currency. Why not? When Buhari took over first as a, quote, military administrator in '84, the Naira was worth $1.34. It was worth more than $1, 1 Naira. It was devalued continually. From 1980 to 2000, currencies in Africa were devalued, terms of trade were created, and the Western debt skyrocketed to several hundred billion of Western debt before China came involved. So the African countries need help because of what was done to them, not because of anything inherent in Africa. So we need assistance, and the assistance is going to be in long-term credit, not trying to make double-digit profits overnight, which is what the West companies want to do. They want to go in there, make investments, pull out money or pull out extractive industry. They need long-term credit, like we had in this country. 15, 20 years, 2 to 3% interest. That gives the opportunity for the infrastructure to make an impact on the economy, and then you make the profit that can pay it back. The other area is human beings. Every human being is created in the image of God. We all, therefore, have a divine spark of creativity, which no machine, no matter what artificial intelligence does, can ever approximate the human mind, because we can make hypotheses that a machine can't make. So therefore, why not have China and Africa learn from each other's culture? And the West should be in there too. We should learn about Confucius. We should learn about the great leaders of Africa and the great cultures of Africa, the Yoruba culture, the great Zimbabwean culture, the great Bantu migration, which almost no one knows anything about, but us African historians. So we can learn, and we can learn about Plato and Socrates. So culture is coming together, sharing ideas, which all believe in the common interest of mankind is good. So whether China would be, quote, absolutely necessary for Africa, that's irrelevant. Right now, it plays a very important role. And there are 647 million people living in poverty in Africa. That's $2 a day or less. China just brought 750 million people out of poverty. So why wouldn't you naturally want to work with someone who has been successful in doing that?
Okay. So thank you, Larry. So let's have Joyce close with her answer.